Well, it's always wonderful to be back at Berkeley. I first came in the summer of 1960, and I rented a room in a fraternity house on Telegraph for $5 a week. It's another world. My topic is how China's territorial expansion is likely to lead to a major military conflict. My major request is that we take the prospect of war seriously. I do not know the future. I am not making a prediction. In fact, I actually think the highest likelihood, if I were to do forecasting, the highest likelihood is that China wins, which means to me that it will become the largest economy in the world. It will become the dominant, most influential power in Asia. It will even be a leader in the Green Revolution, and it will do so without causing a major war. But I don't know that that will happen. None of us know the future. And the likelihood that it doesn't happen, that instead it incites a war, is high enough, and the consequences of war significant enough that I want us to take seriously the causes of war coming out of China. The way I would do this, if I had 2 hours, is I'd introduce you to a field called peace studies. Scandinavian peace researchers are very interested in the topic of what makes for sustained peace and what makes for sustained war. And they show that the regions which are peaceful or war-prone change over time. For example, the first half of the 20th century, the region of the world which had the most people who died in war was Europe. World War I, World War II, wonderful regimes like Stalin and Hitler and so on. Spanish Civil War, you can go on and on. That's not been the case since the end of World War II. Between 1945 and 1980, the region of the world with the most war deaths was East Asia. East Asia being understood as including what we would think was Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Chinese Civil War, Korean War, Indochina Wars, Cambodian genocide, and so on. And after 1979, the world, which today you take more seriously, are well aware that the most war deaths occur in the Middle East and in Central Africa. Anyway, what these peace researchers are interested in is that since 1979, the number of war deaths, despite all the tensions and threats in East Asia, and just to define the way that I defined it, is very low. One of the lowest in the world. In fact, at least as low as Europe. If you remember, places like Serbia exist in Europe too. And they talk about the East Asian peace, and the way I would present this paper, if we had the time, is will the East Asian peace persist? And the peace studies people argue that it's very fragile, the East Asian peace. And I'd like to chat a little bit about what makes the East Asian peace fragile. The argument is made by these people that the key to the East Asian peace, there are many other causes, but the key is the change of leadership in China, something we all talk about. Mao dies. Mao was committed to the notion that war was always on the horizon. Deng Xiaoping takes office, gets committed to economic modernization, ends China's support for insurgent forces all over Southeast Asia, and heads China down a very new path. And the East Asian peace is really a lot to do with Deng Xiaoping. Now, in our normal talking about China and international relations, we have the view that Deng Xiaoping's policies are long gone. His notion that China should hide its strength and bide its time and not take leadership roles and build China up, make China a place where it no longer would be backward, because whatever else Chinese leaders disagreed on, they all agreed that the backward are beaten. And you couldn't be backward. You had to be able to be strong enough that no one could ever do to you again what had happened to you in the past. Well, what I find then, well, the general view from people who study Chinese international relations is then to argue that we've had changes of leadership since Deng, and they've taken more aggressive policies. They've done things that Deng never would have done. They've militarized the South Sea. They've alienated the United States. They've alienated, in fact, the democracies of the world. That the change in leadership has made for a change in foreign policy and has made what had been a cooperative, peace-prone relationship between China and the United States turn into something else. And there are many brave international relation analysts in China who say this all the time. In fact, the truth is they've been saying it since the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s. Sharon, Hung, Molly Chung, some of the names of the theorists who do things like that. Their argument was a very simple argument. They believed that China had to grow strong, and they believed that China needed the United States to grow strong. Cooperative relations with the United States are very important for China's economic growth. And they thought the policy of territorial expansion in maritime Asia, which as they saw it was beginning in the 1990s, was a disaster for China. It would frighten all of its neighbors. It would lead its neighbors to bring American military power right up to Chinese coast. This did not serve China's interests. What served China's interests was to make deals with all of these countries where you set aside a territorial dispute and you agreed to share the energy of and cooperate on the waters. That this would leave China richer. A lot of these places they can't drill now because of disputes. It would leave China richer, it would leave China without enemies, it would leave America far away with nobody wanting America to come into what Chinese saw as China's region. And the really interesting question is why people like Sharon, Hung, and Molly Chung, whose analysis made absolute sense to me, why not only did they lose, Molly Chung at one point has to flee to Hong Kong for his life. Something serious is going on. And the serious that we know that was going on is the Chinese leadership came to believe that this was China's territory. It wasn't about making an economic deal or thinking strategically about the United States. This was China's territory. It had been stolen from China. China was not expanding or being aggressive. It was taking back what was always China's and what had been taken from China. And how could China not go about righting these historical wrongs which China had suffered? The people who put out these other kind of points of view were in certain sense traitors to China. They were standing up for what the foreigners did to China, and it was absolutely unacceptable. Final way of trying to get at this issue for you. So they're saying, they're making you think that maybe leadership isn't so important, that maybe there is a Chinese national identity which makes it, if you're going to be a Chinese patriot, you have no choice but to feel you have to take back these territories, as you will see it. And therefore, and this will be the heart of my paper, the creation of Chinese nationalism in the period following the establishment of the Republic of China in 1911-1912 creates a new Chinese nationalism which inherently has this large vision of Chinese territory. And the only thing that has changed in recent years is Chinese capacity has grown. Because of China's economic wealth and military might, it can now do things which it wished it could have done going back to 1911, 1912. The ambitions of Sun Yat-sen or Chiang Kai-shek or Mao Zedong are not so different from Xi Jinping. The difference is that Xi Jinping has capacity to do things that they didn't have. The argument is that rather than think of Mao as some kind of ideologue or Deng as some kind of pragmatist, they were dealing with very different situations and had different opportunities. That if they were around today, they would be pretty much doing the same thing that Xi Jinping is doing. Let me just give one example of this, and then I'm going to stop. Everybody knows that China claims Maritime Asia. And everybody knows that the claim has no historical basis. It is the case that China never occupied Maritime Asia. In fact, Maritime Asia is a place where if you sailed out, you'd go off the ends of the earth and die. It's a very recent claim. In fact, as I said, it really does come out of the period following the founding of the Republic of China, when China created this new national identity. Now, all I want to show before we stop is that Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping were just as committed to this vision as Xi Jinping. That's the key point that one has to make. So Mao Zedong, as you may not know, when he gave aid to Vietnam in its fight against the French and then against the Americans, had as a condition of that aid that the Vietnamese had to publicly agree that all of the South Sea belonged to China. It had always been Chinese, and Vietnam had no claims to the territory. In Chiang Kaishek, who comes out of this Republic of China, is the most anti-Japan nationalist of all the leaders of China. And he followed very clearly, very closely, the Japanese island hopping through the Pacific, going back to the 20s and 30s, and actually beginning of the 30s. And he was committed to taking that territory for China. He knew he wasn't taking it back, but it was a threat to China. Japan was surrounding China by this island hopping, taking of territory. And when the war ended, Chiang Kai-shek borrowed American ships, took them through the South China Sea, and tried to occupy as many of those islets as possible and make them part of the Republic of China. And there's every reason to believe that the United States, by the way, would have backed what Chiang Kai-shek was doing, because the U.S. was very concerned still about Japanese expansionism at that time, except that the French came back to Indochina. The French were key to what was going to happen in Europe, and the French demand for cooperation with the United States in Europe is the United States back the French interests in Indochina, which included claiming all of that South Sea territory as France. So the United States stayed silent. Meanwhile, Chiang's forces, as you all know, were forced out of the mainland, but they kept control of as many of those islets as possible. And in 1954-55, something usually referred to as the Second Taiwan Crisis, I hate that name, but in 1954-55, the People's Republic decided to end the Taiwan blockade of China. It was the moment, the Bandung period, they were going to go out into the world, and they wanted to end the Taiwan blockade, and the United States wanted to end Taiwan's control of all these islands, which made for unnecessary clashes with China, which the United States did not want to have clashes with China. And so Chiang's troops had to give up all the islands, except for, as everybody knows, Jinmen and Mazu. And many of the islands were occupied by Chiang's troops in the South China Sea. And the Chinese took those islands at that time. Mao took those islands at that time. One of the islands was in Haiphong district, and they generously gave it back to Vietnam. And then they made a deal about settling islands in the Gulf of Tonkin. The truth is that Mao was concerned about these islands from the very beginning. He was not just some ideologue trying to create communism in China. He was also, as all Chinese know, a Chinese patriot. So in 1970 to 72, when they negotiate normalization with Japan, they won't allow anything to be said about the Senkaku. They bracket it off. The basic point out of all of this is contrary to the view that suddenly, in a post-Deng era, Chinese developed a new ambitious agenda of territorial expansion is absolutely untrue. That agenda already existed going back to the founding of the Republic of China in 1911, 1912, and there's every reason to believe that any major leader of China, you didn't need Xi Jinping, would have acted as assertively and in as war-prone a way as Xi Jinping has been acting in recent years. Thank you.